Thank you for thank you all for attending this July installment of the Encompass Mental Health Wellness Programs Awareness and Communication Series. As you may be aware, the series offers a 1-hour presentation every month with various mental health and wellness topics covered by a variety of different speakers. And so before we begin, I just wanted to clarify a few housekeeping items. Number one, for everyone on the line today, your cameras and microphones have been set to remain off during and throughout the presentation, as well as throughout the Q&A. No participants can see any other participants' name or identifying information. This is in place to just maintain the confidentiality of all participants. Number two, for those who couldn't join us today, we are recording the presentation component, which is typically 30 to 40 minutes in length. And so this portion will be posted on the Encompas website under the resources tab. And we will cease recording when we transition over to the Q&A. And number three, as mentioned, we will be hosting a Q&A after the presentation for about 20 to 30 minutes. So please send along any questions or feedback that you have through the Q&A feature, which should be located in the menu bar for this Zoom webinar. Only panelists, those you can see on your screen right now, will be able to see your questions and feedback, and this is not shared with other participants. You can also choose to ask questions or provide feedback anonymously by typing into the field and then selecting the anonymous option that presents itself in the form of a checkbox. I will mediate the Q&A, and our speaker, who I'll introduce shortly, will address the question to the group verbally, again, without identifying the individual who sent the question. So Encompass is really truly a program for OPPers, and we really do take this feedback seriously in the continued development and evolution of the program. So we really encourage you as a participant to send us feedback, send us your questions. That'll help us continue evolving the program and providing you with information that you might need. So now for a brief introduction to our speaker today, we are certainly thrilled to have Carobeth Zorzos with us, exploring mental health services for children and youth, which is really a critical topic for many families, but especially given the circumstances of the last 18 months, it's really come to fruition in a lot of conversations in households. So by way of just a brief introduction, as I said, Carobeth is a psychologist and a board-certified behavioral analyst who has worked with children, youth, and adults with autism spectrum disorders, intellectual and developmental disabilities, behavior disorders, and learning disabilities since 2001. She's worked in both government-funded and private practice settings, and her consultation experience has included a wide variety of settings, which include home and center-based applied behavioral analysis programs, schools, group homes, residential treatment programs, long-term care facilities, adult day programs, etc. And she also has experience working with Indigenous children and youth in rural and remote communities throughout Ontario. At present, Carobeth works with Dalton Associates as the director of the Launch Behavioral Health Division, which serves children, youth, and families affected by autism spectrum disorders and other neurodevelopmental diagnoses. So thank you very much, Carobeth, for joining us this morning. I will hand it off to you and come back when it's time for the Q&A.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that introduction, Michelle. I'm going to share my screen if I am permitted to, which it says that I am not. So if someone could provide permission for me to share my screen, that would be amazing. All right. So I'm having some connection difficulties over here, which is, I always think is funny considering I'm in downtown Toronto, and I would assume that we have the best internet ever, but that is not the case. So if my connection gets choppy, what I will do is just turn my camera off, and then so you can still see the screen and hopefully hear me with no interruptions. So as Michelle had mentioned, I am a clinical psychologist, a board-certified behavior analyst, and the director at Launch Behavioral Health. We provide evidence-based services to children and youth, some of whom are on the autism spectrum, and others who may have other neurodevelopmental disabilities. So today, what we're going to cover, and let me just bring this up here. All right. I'm just going to move this here. So as Michelle mentioned, children and youth mental health has been, it's been an important topic in the past 18 months given COVID. So we've heard quite a lot about it this year. And unfortunately, a lot of the emerging research is showing that there's been some pretty significant declines in children's mental health, given some of the school closures and given some of the social isolation that has resulted from the pandemic measures. So given this, we're seeing that many children and youth are experiencing mental health, behavioral challenges, or learning challenges, some for the first time, and others may have had previous challenges, but are, they're having worsening of symptoms given the current setting. So what we're going to do today is essentially talk a bit about identifying what are some of the areas and concerns to look for, when to seek help, what services are available for families and children, and then how to access those services and supports. Okay. So what are some signs of possible mental health concerns in children and youth? So this is a nice summary that that's from Canadian Mental Health Association. And I think that before delving into these, a word of caution, some of these pieces can really be part of an overall typical developmental trajectory for children and youth. We're going to chat a bit about when it's appropriate to seek help in the next slide. But these are some pieces that may occur that may prompt you to seek some help for your child or youth. So some pieces that we're definitely seeing a lot more of are around school and school success. So if your child or youth if you're seeing significantly lower marks in school, or maybe getting into arguments with teachers or peers, that could be a cause for concern. Some other pieces to look out for are around avoiding friends and family, especially when it comes to activities and preferred things that a child or youth may like to engage in. So if they're avoiding things that they have historically liked, so if they have historically loved to go camping, but now is just not interested in it at all, that could be problematic. Some of the other pieces are around sort of acting out behaviors. So if you're seeing a lot of outbursts of anger, aggression, or acting out towards authority, so whether that's parents or teachers, that could be something that could be concerning. Some other pieces are around frequent drug and alcohol use. Now, we do know that drug and alcohol experimentation definitely happens within youth, but certainly if it's impacting a youth's ability to complete their schoolwork or impacts their relationships with others, that may be a time to seek help. Other things to look for are around risk-taking behaviors. So again, can be very typical given teenagers, but if you're seeing some extremes to that, so whether that's driving while intoxicated or maybe talking to strangers online and trying to meet with them, those could definitely be concerning. Some other pieces that you could be seeing are around and we definitely see this in females as well as males, worrying or constantly being obsessed with weight or food intake. We know that sometimes that can be a precursor to some eating disorders, which can occur in that child and youth phase. Other pieces to look at include mood swings, so going from very depressed and low energy to very excitable and full of energy and lots of activity. And then on the other side of that, any challenges around lacking motivation, not wanting to do things that they've previously enjoyed, or just having a very sad and down mood overall. Some of the other pieces that we look for are around changes to sleeping and eating habits. So that can be either sleeping or eating too much or not sleeping or eating enough. So again, as I mentioned, some of these are pretty typical in terms of things that you may see within children and youth. So when is it appropriate to seek help? So if any of the pieces that I spoke about before, if any of these are very intense, if they persist over long periods of time, and that can be from weeks to months, if it's something that's inappropriate for a child's age. So I like to give the example for this where if you have a 2 or 3-year-old, as you probably well know, tantrums can happen. So falling to the floor, kicking, screaming, yelling. These are all things that are pretty typical for a 2 or 3-year-old. If a 15 or 16-year-old are engaging in those behaviors, that's a bit concerning and would definitely warrant some intervention and support. And then finally, and most importantly, if any of these are interfering with your child's life, so that could be impacting their school, their relationships with family and friends, or their ability to take care of themselves. So we've talked a bit about when sort of some potential pieces and potential areas where you may want to seek help and when you should seek help. So I want to chat briefly about what are some of the services that are actually available out there. So I want to preface this with these are not an exhaustive list by any means in terms of services available. So I've tried to highlight the services that are most common and then talk a bit about some of the more common specialized services. There are a couple of pieces that are missing here that I'm just going to identify up front. So one of the pieces is psychiatric supports. Now this is very common to assist in mental health concerns with children and youth. A psychiatrist is essentially a medical doctor that is trained to support individuals' mental health. Usually they are involved in prescribing and monitoring psychotropic medication. In terms of accessing those services, those are generally accessed through a referral from your primary healthcare provider. So whether that's your family physician or nurse practitioner, those individuals can give you a referral if that's an appropriate pathway for support. The other piece that I won't spend a lot of time on this morning is around crisis supports. So there's definitely a crisis network for children and youth. I'm going to share with you some of those services and links at the end of the talk, but will not speak to those in depth. Okay. So the 4 areas I'm going to focus on today are going to be psychotherapy, psychological and psychoeducational assessment, behavior supports, and specialized services and supports. Okay, so let's talk about psychotherapy first. This is one of the most common mental health supports that children and youth access. So essentially psychotherapy is, it involves a clinician, and this can be a social worker, a registered psychotherapist, a registered psychologist, or someone working under a registered psychologist. And they are essentially working with the child or youth and their family to bring about positive change in that child's thinking, feeling, behavior, and social functioning. So how they go about that is essentially developing strategies that the child or youth can learn within sessions, and then practice outside of sessions in their daily life. So psychotherapy is sometimes referred to in different ways. So you may hear it referred to as talk therapy or counseling, things of that nature. Generally, it's referring to the concept of meeting one-on-one with a therapist and talking about what your concerns are and creating a plan to address those concerns. Now, there are different modalities that psychotherapy can be referred to as well. Cognitive behavior therapy is a more common one, where physicians or psychologists may indicate that this is appropriate for a child to receive. The other piece to note is that sometimes, and I'm going to focus more on one-to-one therapy, but there are definitely different therapy modalities. So there can be one-to-one, there's family therapy, there's group therapy where there are other children and youth involved, but I'll speak more to one-to-one therapy today. So some of the questions that I get as a clinician when families ask, what exactly is therapy? They will ask, what does it look like? What happens, right? Oftentimes in popular culture, it can be presented in a very different way than it is actually in practice today. So how it looks really depends on a child's age, in addition to what exactly you're working on in terms of your therapy goal. So for younger children, we really focus on working with a child within the context of fun or play-based activities. We generally start working with kids within the context of psychotherapy when they have the skills to be able to articulate thoughts and feelings. So really that's it. Oftentimes around that 7, 8, 9-year-old range. It may vary based on the child's specific skills. But in order to maintain a child's interest and also engagement within therapy, presenting it within the context of play is often the best approach. And what happens is the therapy goals are integrated into those activities. So they may be talking about their thoughts, feelings, behaviors, but within the context of that play. For youth and older children, it's a bit more focused just on that back and forth talking about what concerns there are and working towards some strategies of how the individual can cope with those challenges outside of session. So this is where it's very important that families come in, especially for younger children. Oftentimes, when people do come to therapy, there's a lot of focus on building some of these skills and strategies, but those can be very difficult to implement in the real world. So for example, one of the more common referral reasons for us is around children and youth and their emotional regulation. So that's simply the ability to identify your thoughts and feelings and then being able to manage your emotions appropriately, which sounds simple enough, but is very difficult for kids and can be difficult for adults as well. When we're working with children and youth, we identify strategies that we want them to practice, we will often share these with parents so they can support their child and youth in those strategies. So for example, we may be working with a child who is working on taking a walk or going to listen to music when they're getting stressed out or getting upset. So letting the parent know that this is that these are options can help that situation where they can assist the child or youth in reminding them about those coping strategies. So in terms of the session types, generally sessions are about an hour, depending on the focus. And there often is a check-in, especially for younger children, around how parents can support any of the strategies that were developed within the session, how they can support outside of session. For older children and youth, there's often a focus on homework, which is, these are some things I want you to do and report back to me on at our next session. So therapy is generally quite goal-driven, so typically 1 or 2 goals, and typically pretty time limited. So these can happen over a course of weeks or months. And then when that goal is met, maybe just looking at maintenance or booster sessions over time to maintain those skills. Okay. So I'm going to move on now to some other services and supports. So again, one of the more common services that are sought are around psychological assessment for children and youth. So I'm going to speak broadly to this in terms of what a psychological assessment is, and then I'm going to narrow that down and really focus on psychoeducational assessments. So psychological assessments are essentially a process where a psychologist gathers information about your child or youth. This is done through a number of ways. So this can be done through questionnaires, interviews, in addition to standardized testing. The goal of assessments are essentially to identify, it's often to identify a specific psychological diagnosis, which can lead to appropriate treatment for your child or youth. So psychoeducational assessments are often referred to or often suggested for children or youth who may be struggling at school. So it's a specific type of assessment that determines how your child learns across several different domains. It assists in diagnosing learning disabilities or any other disorders that may be interfering with your child or youth's learning. And at the end of that process, recommendations are made in terms of how can the school and how can parents support the child and youth's learning based on the results. Okay. So I'm going to talk a bit about the psychoeducational assessment process. Now, again, this is a general overview. Different psychologists may have different processes that they go through. This is how our team typically completes psychoeducational assessments. So I will go through the process and sort of what to expect. So I like to conceptualize these assessments in 3 different areas. So the first piece is the pre-assessment. So this is where you will have a call with a psychologist. And the goal of that is to identify what exactly your concerns are and if a psychoeducational assessment is appropriate for your child or youth. Oftentimes we'll ask also about the referral source for the assessment. Again, most frequently, it's a school personnel. It's school personnel, so maybe a special education teacher, another teacher, or school staff who is recommended accessing this type of assessment. So the next piece is essentially gathering background information. So I explain this to people as my goal is to get to know your child or youth and in a pretty small amount of time, right? So that means getting as much information as possible about how they learn so we can make an informed decision and recommendations. So what this looks like is we will ask for information such as report cards, individual education plans, if those are in place, any kind of testing or involvement with other professionals, and any notes or anything from teachers. We'll also ask to complete questionnaires. These are often standardized and structured, And they're often around a variety of questions. So some are around learning, some are around other skills like organization and planning, emotional regulation, and some may be around adaptive behaviors. So how independent your child is at home and school. We will also ask for your teachers or the child's teacher's input. This is very important in a psychoeducational assessment because it's important to have an accurate picture of how your child is performing in class and sort of why or what concerns the teachers have at that time. So that's before the actual assessment process gets started. So it's quite a large amount of information. The psychologist and other members of the team will review that information prior to the assessment so they can be better prepared for when parents and the child or youth come in and complete direct testing. So the second part of the assessment is the actual direct assessment piece. And that is sort of broken down into two areas. So we have the parent interview. So that's essentially where the psychologist or other team member will meet with the parents and review all of the documentation that you've shared. So that's going to include things like developmental history, all of the report cards, that information to ensure that they have an accurate understanding and ask any clarifying questions that they may need. The second piece is direct testing with a child using standardized measures across a number of domains. So standardized tests are essentially tests that are given to a large number of people, and there are norms that are developed. And what happens is when a child or youth takes the test, their performance is compared to all other children or youth their same age. So given this, the tests are quite structured, and we look at a variety of different testing activities. So we look at cognitive skills, which are essentially learning and thinking skills. This is also referred to as an IQ test. We also look at academic skills. So we'll complete tests around reading, writing, math, and compare your child or youth's performance to other children their age. We'll also look at pieces such as learning and memory, a child's ability to learn visually versus auditorily, so what they hear. We will look at attention and whether sustaining attention is difficult for that child or youth. And we may also look at pieces such as language, so how well your child understands what is communicated to them and how well they communicate with other people. And then finally, social and emotional skills. So these are pieces specifically around mental health and how mood, anxiety, self-esteem, and other social emotional variables may be impacting that child's learning. So this process where we're completing the direct assessment can take anywhere from 1 to 2 full days, if not more. How the sessions are structured really depends on the psychologist and also your child or youth. For younger children, it may be a series of short appointments. For older individuals, it may be close to full days of working. Again, this is going to be dependent on what the psychologist and the family decide together. One of the more common questions that we've received during the pandemic especially is, can you complete a psychoeducational assessment online? So unfortunately, while we can complete certain pieces of it online, we cannot complete assessments fully online. And the reason for that is there are many tests which require physical manipulation of materials that is just not, unfortunately, not feasible through just a virtual platform. However, there are definitely pieces that we can complete online. We often encourage parents to complete some of the interview portions via Zoom, either before or after the in-person assessment, to minimize some of the necessity to meet in person. But again, this is discussed with the psychologist and the family. So the third piece of psychoeducational assessment is the report and feedback process. So now we have all of this information about a child or youth, and we have to organize it, analyze it, and essentially summarize so it makes sense to you, it makes sense to the teachers. We talk about diagnostic considerations. So does the child meet criteria for any type of learning disabilities or other disorders? And then most importantly, what are the support and treatment options that are recommended? So what often happens as a result of psychoeducational assessments are we will make recommendations for a child to receive additional support at school. So that may be in the form of what we call learning accommodations. So that's a teacher or other staff personnel changing the way they're presenting material to ensure that the child or youth is fully understanding and learning the material. And then there are also learning modifications. So that's where the actual material that's being presented to the child is different than what would be expected at their age. So it may be that a grade 4 child is very far behind in reading and they need to catch up. So their work may be modified to a grade 3 or grade 2 level to ensure that they acquire the prerequisite skills in order to move on. So these are all recommendations that would be made within the context of that report. And then a feedback meeting is held with the family and the child and or youth, depending on the appropriateness of them coming in and participating in the feedback. Oftentimes we have a separate feedback afterwards for youth, so we can present information in an age-appropriate way and in a way that is supportive and they also understand. So during those feedback meetings, we walk through the report in detail, talk about results, recommendations, and then answer questions that parents have. Our feedback meetings generally take a couple of hours, and sometimes we have to have follow-ups if there's additional questions. One important question that you should ask any psychologist that you're working with is if they're willing to meet with your teacher or with your child or youth teacher or other school personnel to share the results of the assessment. This is often very helpful for families and for teachers. I know for our team, we're very supportive of that process to ensure that the teachers and school get that information so they can put in those supports to make sure the child is learning. Okay. So we're going to switch gears and talk a bit about behavior support. So this is another service that is available for children who may be experiencing mental health, behavior, or learning challenges. Behavior support is essentially, it's focused very much on parents or caregivers, and it essentially gives parents tools to support their child in either reducing challenging behaviors or teaching new skills. So what happens is a clinician will develop a treatment plan in conjunction with the family and provide coaching to that family to support them in implementing the recommendations. So behavior support is generally well suited for younger children where a child is not able to implement their own strategies and they need a lot of parental guidance, or children where they have significant behavior challenges. Some of the pieces that we see and we often get referred for behavior support are situations such as having tantrums, arguing and fighting with siblings, refusing to do homework, and one of our more common ones recently is around gaming and essentially having difficulties going offline and engaging in activities. So we have a lot of kids who are really focused right now on being at home, playing, video games. So these are some of the things where a clinician can support families in encouraging positive behavior change. So what this looks like is that a parent or caregiver will meet with a clinician and they'll talk about what their concerns are. And they will come up with a goal. Usually there's 1 to 2 goals. And then they will come up with a plan for how to gather information. So because this is a parent-mediated intervention, parents will gather information in between sessions. So what they'll do is gather or record when the challenging behavior is occurring, under what circumstances is it occurring, how often does it occur. So they're essentially gathering data and information that will help the clinician develop a good evidence-based plan to change that behavior. So once the clinician has all of that information, they will create a plan that focuses on preventing challenging behaviors, reducing any challenging behaviors in a consistent and positive way, and also teaching appropriate alternative skills. So this could be, so if we go back to the example of gaming, so this could be encouraging and providing incentives for offline activities, whether that's riding your bike outside or playing with friends, those types of things, and discouraging and providing some parameters around how often gaming is permitted. So the positive thing about behavior support is the clinician not only trains the family on how to complete the strategies, they follow them for a period of several weeks after to ensure that if strategies are not working, to make sure that they tweak or revise those suggestions to ensure that the strategies are working. So those are our behavior support. So I'm going to move now into specialized services and supports. So again, this is not an inclusive list or an exhaustive list. These are some of the more common services that we encounter and may be helpful for children and youth. So one of the pieces that is pretty common that we see referrals for is around ADHD coaching. So individuals who are diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And what that looks like is essentially a clinician providing specific coaching for a child and youth to work on skills related to ADHD. Now, many people may not understand that ADHD, oftentimes you think of, okay, a child who's very hyper and can't sustain attention and gets distracted easily. And those can definitely be features. But some of the more challenging and problematic features of ADHD are more related to what we call executive function skills. So those are skills related to being able to regulate your emotions and behaviors, and also your cognitive regulation skills. That's the ability to essentially sit down, plan, organize tasks. So with ADHD coaching, a lot of that looks at self-regulation, teaching self-regulation, teaching organization skills, and teaching study skills. Another common specialized service and supports are ABA, so Applied Behavior Analysis for Autism Spectrum Disorder. This is a program that's actually funded by the government, and has a lot of good support for for improving children and youth's social communication skills, and also decreasing challenging behaviors. And then finally, there are intensive mental health supports for individuals who have very serious mental health concerns. So individuals where they may be experiencing life-threatening challenges, such as suicidal ideation and attempts, or severe eating disorders, they may require more intensive support, such as day treatment programs or residential live-in options. Okay, so now that we've talked about some of the services and supports available to children and youth, how do you access these supports? So this is a very important piece, and because the group that I'm chatting with today are very lucky in that you have access to Encompas, which provides service navigation and supports to connect you to different services. And there's the option to access psychological and counseling and assessment services through extended healthcare benefits. So the Encompas information is there. Also, just for the general public, Connects Ontario has resources around mental health services and supports. And finally, referrals from your family physician or nurse practitioner are also can be also very appropriate. They're generally very knowledgeable of what services and supports are locally available, and can often provide referrals for those. And then in closing, I'm just going to leave you with some resources here. As I mentioned at the outset, because we did not delve into crisis resources, I've listed some of those here. In addition to some additional resources to online services and supports for mental health for youth, in addition to some other web pages that provide information on available mental health services. Okay. So that concludes my presentation today. So I'm going to hand it over to Michelle and enter our Q&A portion.